Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, has given a speech that has made some people hope that Australia might pursue a foreign policy more independent of the United States of America.
As Paul Keating put it in his John Curtin Memorial Lecture, Curtin began us thinking on our own terms. So we remember Curtin not just because he looked to America. We honour him because he spoke for Australia.
Or even make a strategic turn in its foreign policy. He spoke of progressive patriotism and invoked the spirit of John Curtin, Australia's wartime leader, who in 1941 stood up to Churchill and Franklin Delaware Roosevelt and said Australia would look to America free of the pangs of tradition. But you might ask, if you're in Australia, well, Albo, are you going to cancel the dud subs deal under AUKUS? Or if you are from the rest of the world, no doubt most of my viewers, you might ask, well, isn't Australia the loyalist and blindest of US vassals? What are you talking about, Albo? About thinking for yourself. So here's the question of this video. Was this speech a genuine strategic pivot towards Australian independence, or a piece of political marketing designed to conceal ongoing subservience to American interests? I'm Jeff Rich, author, historian and former government official, and in my career as a government official I wrote quite a lot of speeches for government leaders. It was one of my sort of specialties, so to speak. And so I'm trying to bring that experience today for you to make sense of this speech by Anthony Albanese. I'm going to dissect it and help you understand it better. Understand the historical comparison that Anthony Albanese is making in the speech, and assess whether the rhetoric is genuinely new, whether there is strategy and substance behind the speech, behind the words, and whether Australia's conception of its role in the world has changed in any material way. And finally, whether the government has actually understood this historical moment that we're all faced with right now. Is Australia charting a new post-Trump foreign policy, or is Albo's progressive patriotism the latest refuge of a scoundrel? Australia's choices and Albo's speeches are part of two larger global trends. Across the world, countries are adapting their foreign policies to the new realities of diminished US power and the bullying tactics of Donald Trump. The choices are hardest for US allies and friends. Do they give in to bad daddy? In Mark Rutte's term, you could almost call Donald Trump bad grandpa. Do you give in to bad daddy and pay up in extra defence spending? Or do they wait out in the hope of a return of a good daddy, a normal USA, the same old US empire? Or do they grow up, leave home, and start to act independently in what is increasingly obviously a multipolar world? The second phenomenon that's occurring across the world, in which it's best to place Anthony Albanese's speech, is the way in which political parties are devising rhetoric or political tactics, if you like, to respond to the nationalist or populist backlash against globalism and various aspects of earlier phases of globalisation that have been common across the world since, the 2010s. From Labour in Britain to Merz in Germany to the Democrats in the United States of America, centrist and progressive and right-wing parties are all wrapping themselves in war talk to make nationalism and militarism fashionable again. Albo's speech also needs to be understood in its Australian context. Yes, it's not all about America. Albo's speech comes at a sensitive moment. There is growing criticism domestically of Australia's submission to the United States on Gaza, on Iran, on war with China, and especially the AUKUS submarine deal. And in the last week or so, an enormous scandal has broken out over the Australian government's seeming submission to both Benjamin Netanyahu's desire and a rather extreme report from a so-called anti-Semitism special envoy who appears to be closely associated with Israeli-American interests. But in particular, the AUKUS deal is causing particular problems for the Albanese government because it is an enormously expensive operation that even Donald Trump's America seems to want to make more expensive. As Sam Roggeveen has highlighted on this show, before, this deal really is a fiasco. $365 billion to get some second-hand subs in the 2030s, maybe the 2040s. And in the meantime, America gets to use Australia as a base of operations in a war with China and demand Australia be an active combatant in that war, all in order to protect trade with our major trading partner, China, protect our trade routes with our major trading partner, China, from, you guessed it, China. And more recently, a review by the China Hawk Defense Deputy Secretary in the United States administration, Elbridge Colby, part of a dynastic CIA family, threatens to demand more, and especially that Australia declare it will commit submarines in the event of a USA war on China. In effect, the USA is asking Australia to make a preemptive declaration of war against China, against our major trading partner. China has criticised the AUKUS deal, and Albo is scheduled to meet Xi later this year. What will he say? Will Australia stand up for itself? Will it think for itself, or will it submit to the USA and preemptively declare war as Australian PM Robert Menzies in 1930 did for Britain's war with Germany? That because the American empire is at war with China, Australia is therefore at war with China, even before that war has kinetically begun. Understanding this context helps you understand the subtext of Anthony Albanese's speech and the implied comparisons in Albanese's speech between history and today's dilemmas.
Through 124 years of our federation and 31 Prime Ministers of Australia, John Curtin stands apart. No leader of our nation has faced a sterner test.
It reaches back to Australia's history in World War II. 2 years after the European side of that war began in 1939, what was it? I guess 10 years after it had begun in Asia in 1931, the British Empire was on its knees. Germany controlled Europe and North Africa. Operation Barbarossa surrounded Leningrad and Moscow. Japan had devastated China. course, Albo's speech does not mention this broader context at all of the broader context of world history in his speech. He focuses on how John Curtin bravely stood up for Australia in this moment.
Singapore had fallen. Darwin had been bombed. And he was locked in a battle of wills with the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, as well as the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. John Curtin, a person so mindful of his flaws and limitations, pushing back against two of the most powerful men in the world and two of the most forceful personalities of 20th century politics. This moment is the core of the Curtin legend. Two divisions of the Australian Imperial Force returning from the Middle East. Curtin wanted those troops for the defence of Australia. Churchill wanted them in Burma, and Roosevelt backed him. Barely 2 months after Curtin had said that Australia looked to America, America was telling us to listen to Britain.
On 7th of October 1941, John Curtin became Prime Minister, replacing the Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who previously had declared war on behalf of the British Empire for Australia, and would later, from 1949 to the late 1960s, end up being one of Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On 7th of December, 2 months after John Curtin became Prime Minister, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Finally, the United States entered World War II, but Japan did not attack Pearl Harbor or the United States. Only there were coordinated attacks on US and British colonies in Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong. 3 weeks later, Curtin wrote his famous New Year's message, where he said, without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. It was a crucial, brave, decisive moment in the history of Australian foreign policy, but let's face it, quite frankly, John Curtin did not have a whole lot of choice. The British were not in a position to help anyhow. 6 weeks later, the fortress of Singapore fell. The British Empire lost its supposedly impregnable fortress in Southeast Asia. This was the strategic catastrophe in which Curtin demanded the Australian troops come home, as referred to in Albanese's speech, and in which Curtin fought against Churchill and Roosevelt in this very difficult moment for all of them. And Curtin demanded a key role for Australia as a partner with the USA in planning the Pacific War.
That's what Curtin recognised. This was a Pacific War. It was its own conflict which demanded its own strategy. Our security could not be outsourced to London or trusted to vague assurances from Britain. We needed an Australian foreign policy anchored in strategic reality, not bound by tradition, dealing with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be.
But notice what Albanese is doing here. He's not just invoking Curtin as a symbol of the US alliance, he's presenting him as a symbol of Australian independence, supposed independence, within that alliance. He implied that just as Curtin had to make tough decisions in Australia's national interest during World War II, and he certainly did, contemporary Australia must think for itself while remaining committed, of course, to its allies. He even goes so far as to say Australia co-authored the post-war rules-based order.
It was the Curtin and Chifley governments that brought Australia into the United Nations, the World Bank and the IMF at the outset. Australia didn't just join the institutions which created the international rules-based order, we helped shape them.
There is an element, a small element of truth to that, and I'll address that more in another video. But throughout the speech, Albanese repeatedly positioned himself as following in Curtin's footsteps. There's even an element of personal identification between Curtin and Albanese.
John Curtin did not push to seize power. Instead, power came to him. The Parliament and the nation turned to Labor. And within 4 months of being sworn in as Prime Minister, Curtin found himself leading the battle for Australia.
A wartime leader who had to navigate between loyalty to allies and Australia's sovereign interests. The subtext was clear. Just as Curtin had done in 1941, Albanese was prepared to put Australia first when necessary. So that is the implied message. Is Albo saying that Australia will defy Trump and Xi Jinping and put Australia first in crafting a revised rules-based world order in the post-US-led post-1945, whatever comes after Trump has destroyed the post-1945 world order? Now, some observers who I really respect, like Jean Pang and Bertrand Arnault, suggested that this speech and some of the gestures of Australia to meet with the Chinese leader represent what they called a thought-through or strategic shift, a breakthrough in thinking, I think is what he means. Some kind of indication that Australia is preparing to go its own way, at least from Trump's America. Progressive voices in Australia have certainly hoped so, echoing Albanese's theme of progressive patriotism as a new way forward. I am sceptical for 4 reasons. Rhetoric, policy, the idea of Australia in the world embedded in both the speech and in the government's foreign policy actions, and the understanding of the moment in history that we are in. And after all, that's what I kind of focus on here on this channel, trying to learn from history so that you can both understand and adapt to the changing mode of this multipolar world that we're seeing around us. So, is Albanese's rhetoric in this speech genuinely new? The short answer is not really. Australian Labor leaders have been invoking John Curtin for decades. He's become something of a nationalist Labor icon, regularly wheeled out whenever the party needs to demonstrate its credentials on national security, sovereignty, moral integrity, genuine independence, and all the rest of it. And, of course, the sort of early nationalist Australian historian Manning Clark turned John Curtin into something of a saint. He, too, identified with other aspects of John Curtin's behaviour, not least his drinking. And this rhetoric fits into a long-standing Labor tradition of positioning itself as the party more engaged with Asia, while painting the Liberals as overly focused on America and Britain. There's some dimensions of truth to this, but it's a vast political exaggeration. It's really a familiar political playbook. Labor as the party of Asian engagement and sophisticated multilateralism versus the Liberals as the party of traditional Western alignment, and particularly being the USA's deputy sheriff in Asia. Similarly, Albanese invokes an old trope of Australian political rhetoric that Labor is the party of initiative. And it has a long tradition in Australian history, and it's really not a particularly sophisticated concept, although the historian Frank Bongiorno has revived this tired old Australian Labor legend in his political history, Dreamers and Schemers. The progressive element of Albanese's rhetoric picks up directly from the successful election campaign that has just his successful election victory that many interpreted as a rebuff to Donald Trump. But let's be honest, it's a fairly faint echo of genuine social democracy. It's more about contrasting with Trump's America than representing any genuine social democratic agenda within Australia today. What is still relatively new is this explicit embrace of patriotism and a form of nationalism as a term in government rhetoric. For decades, Australian progressives have been uncomfortable with nationalist and patriotic language and symbols and have generally ceded that ground to conservatives. Albanese's willingness to claim patriotism for the progressive cause, however, is primarily a tactical shift. Because here's the thing, progressive patriotism itself is a US import. It's actually a term borrowed from the US Democratic Party, waving American flags, talking about progressive patriotism and attempting, as part of that global trend I talked about earlier, for centre-left parties, centrist and centre-left parties to sort of reclaim nationalist sentiment for themselves against the populist right. So while the packaging might be new, the underlying message is really quite familiar. American primacy is good for Australia, so we're thinking for ourselves when we say we want more American primacy. It's independence rhetoric in the service of continued dependence. Is the substance new? Now, let's look beyond the rhetoric to the actual substance, because ultimately what matters isn't what politicians say, although that does matter, but what they do or try to do. On security policy, there's really absolutely no change in the government's approach to matters. Australia remains fully committed to AUKUS despite growing doubts, and those doubts are significant. There are people on the Labor side of politics who are criticising it, most noticeably Gareth Evans, who I've had on this program, and I'll include a link to my interview with Gareth Evans in the video description below. But we're talking about a program here that could cost upwards of and beyond $368 billion, with delivery dates that keep slipping, technological challenges that keep mounting, and Washington is demanding more and more, both money and, I guess, the blood price of getting Australia committed to a war against China. And what's more, Defence Minister Richard Marles in Australia has really recently said we're all in for that war. He wasn't talking on my part, but that's okay. On trade, there are some marginal adjustments in Australia's position, but certainly significant adjustment. Australia has been working more closely with Asia Pacific and other countries to coordinate responses to the wild, unpredictable and destructive tariff policies of the United States government. And there has been some rhetorical distancing from Trump's protectionist agenda. Australia has always and always will have a strong commitment to a multilateral trading system. And it is working with the sensible people of the Asia Pacific to try to make that happen and continue to happen, particularly US allies like Japan and South Korea. But also, I would also say with India. In any case, with this, most of the real action is behind the scenes. It's not the kind of dispute that really gets aired a lot in speeches, patriotic speeches like the John Curtin Memorial Lecture. It's something that really needs to be sort of assessed carefully with experts like Warwick Powell, who I've also had on the program. Diplomatically, there's also not been a fundamental shift in Australia's stance on the alliance, or more broadly, its understanding of international relations. Albanese continues to champion the liberal rules-based international order and talks about strengthening the alliance of democracies, and includes rhetoric that brings that up in his John Curtin Memorial Lecture. These are the same talking points we've heard from Australian leaders for decades. It is true that Albo did not attend NATO, but nor did the Japanese or South Korean leaders. But I think that was really more to do with a focus on Europe rather than a distancing from America. Australia, however, has made positive noises about increasing its defence spending. It fell in behind the USA in its illegal strikes on Iran. It repeated the same tired talking points at the Quad. It is acting quite coercively within Australia against alleged anti-Semitism, in line with the most repressive of Trump's policies in the USA. And most recently, at the ASEAN Foreign Minister Penny Wong made a very pro-US speech, which some people say embarrassed Australia in front of ASEAN. The same ASEAN meeting where ASEAN ministers embraced Russia and strong relationships between Russia, and the Indonesian foreign minister said, well, if Trump imposes tariffs on us, that is a price we have to pay for BRICS, multilateralism, and ultimately the price of sovereignty. Not a kind of comment we hear from Australian ministers. Australia is, if it is making diplomatic noises to put a bit more distance between it and America, it is really more between Australia's current leadership and the America's current leadership, rather than the American state, the American empire as such. It's a contrast, I would say, with even the Japanese leaders who, in the context of an election, have talked about calling directly for more independence for Japan, rather than just coded comparisons. Or indeed the Indonesian president, who attended the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, sat together with Vladimir Putin in the final plenary, and clearly got on very well with them. They both have a deep mutual respect for each other. Indonesia's embraced the Russian-ASEAN partnership and declares it wants 1,000 friends and no enemies. Perhaps Albo should go and talk to Prabowo and stop his sentimental histories of John Curtin. Australia, I would say, is really looking to keep the region under the same old American neocolonial rules-based order. It wants Washington to plan the future of our region. It isn't really interested in our future being decided in the region by anyone other than the United States.
John Curtin is rightly honoured as the founder of Australia's alliance with the United States, a pillar of our foreign policy. our most important defence and security partnership, and a relationship that commands bipartisan support, respect and affection in both our nations.
So what the speech really indicates was signalling a way of indicating some discomfort with Trump's approach while maintaining absolute loyalty to America. When it returns to normal after Trump, it's not strategic independence, it's servile patience. So if the rhetoric hasn't changed and the substance hasn't changed, what about Australia's conception of its role in the world? Has that evolved at all in recent years, with all the dramatic unwinding, all the, as Dr. S.J. Shankar says, the churning of the world and the clearing of the mists that show that it really is a multipolar world out there? Well, the answer here too is definitively no. Albanese's speech was completely subscribed to the idea of a US-led, rules-based international order. The fiction that this order was devised in freedom in 1945 and has been stable and reliable ever since. And I've described how much a fiction that is in one of my videos on the post-1945 world, with a link in the video description below. There was no questioning of this fundamental assumption at all. It's a fundamental misreading of the strategic situation, perhaps a misreading of the strategic situation as catastrophically incorrect, as assuming that Singapore was an impregnable fortress that would guarantee Australia's security in Asia. What was interesting was how Albanese positioned Australia as a co-creator of this post-1945 order, not just a beneficiary. Like Curtin before him, he was claiming a role in helping to plan US strategy as a more equal partner rather than a junior ally. But this is still fundamentally about being a loyal node in what I call a networked empire, the US networked empire. Australia wants more input into decision making, but it's not questioning the basic structure of American hegemony, American empire. What's completely absent from Albanese's vision is any serious engagement with the reality of an increasingly multipolar and multilateral and multi-civilizational world, in the terms used by Kishore Mahbubani, the distinguished former Singaporean diplomat. There's no attempt to think about how Australia might position itself differently in this more multilateral, multipolar, multi-civilizational international system. The closest historical parallel, indeed, is actually Curtin's own vision of a fourth British Empire. Now, this is part of John Curtin's thinking that Albanese does not really discuss. But after the catastrophe of late 1941 and early 1942, after the strategic abyss, which is the term John Darwin uses to describe the state of the British Empire in late 1941, early 1942. After that period, John Curtin was not so much looking to America as looking to build a fourth British Empire in which the white dominions of New Zealand, Canada, Australia and white South Africa, white apartheid South Africa, had greater influence and greater input into imperial strategy while remaining fundamentally loyal to the imperial centre. It's a fascinating story and I will describe it more in a forthcoming video. Albanese may be suggesting or hoping for, I'm not sure he's quite got a plan or a strategy to do this apart from hoping to outlast Donald Trump, but he might be suggesting a similar arrangement with American hegemony. If they are thinking that way, I think they are dreaming. The practical result is that Australia continues to see itself as doing America's work in the region, containing China, maintaining US access, and ensuring regional stability, so-called, on American terms. That is the 1945 American partition of Eurasia, which I've described in previous videos. The rhetoric about independence obscures this fundamental reality. Finally, have the Australian geopolitical strategists who are informing and advising Anthony Albanese, have they got a deep insight into the nature of this historical moment? This is perhaps where the speech's limitations are strikingly obvious.
Today, at the safe distance of 8 decades, the story of the Second World War is set in our memory. The Allied victory over tyranny has, in retrospect, taken on a feel of inevitability.
There's no attempt at all to grapple with what Chinese leaders call changes unseen in 100 years, unprecedented changes in 100 years, the fundamental transformation of global power, resources, culture, what some people call global order, before our very eyes. There's no serious engagement with changing power dynamics globally or acknowledgement of America's diminished role in the world, the diminished need for all those American troops and weapons, and the tattered image of American freedom and democracy all around the world. The rise of alternative economic and political arrangements is simply ignored. You won't find any reference to BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or other manifestations of the emerging multipolar world. It's as if these developments simply don't exist in the nationalist, progressive, patriotic worldview of the Australian government. This reflects what I would describe as a parochial perspective on the world crisis of 1941 to 1942 that Albanese invokes when describing Curtin. I referred to that briefly earlier in the video. It's all about, bringing the troops back home rather than sending them to Burma. There is no discussion of the absolute strategic abyss that the British Empire was in, and the serious possibility in late 1941 and 1942 that Germany would really actually conquer Russia and control Eurasia. Adolf Hitler would have actually finally fulfilled Alfred Mackinder's imperialist fantasy. The focus is entirely on trite Western and American sort of narratives about the current crisis, and no serious reflection on the fundamental shift in global power arrangements, the kind of fundamental shift that John Curtin had to make hard decisions about when he realised there was no way the British Empire could actually defend Australia, and frankly, there was not all that much interest from the United States in defending Australia either. It wanted to have victory over Japan and control China. Australia was one of the dominions of the British Empire it didn't actually care all that much about. So rather than think seriously about this profound historical moment, which is what I have been trying to do on the Burning Archive YouTube channel over the last couple of years and on my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, rather than do that, Australian leaders are just clinging to trite concepts like the post-1945 world order of democracy, the alliance of democracies, and the Western rules, liberal rules-based order. It's as if they are still living in 1999 and have paid no attention at all to the economic, political, cultural transformations that have fundamentally altered the global landscape. So what is my overall judgment? Let me give you my overall assessment. When we test Albanese's speech against these 4 dimensions I outlined earlier, it fails on every count. The rhetoric, while polished in a modern way, isn't genuinely new. It's recycled American Democrat messaging delivered with an Australian accent. The substance shows no meaningful departure from existing policy frameworks. Australia's conception of its global role remains locked in a US-centric world view, and there's no serious engagement with the historical transformations reshaping our world. What we're looking at here is essentially a deceptive speech that uses rhetorical distance from Trump to conceal continued subjection to US interests. In that sense, progressive patriotism is just as Samuel Johnson described. Patriotism, it is the latest refuge of a scoundrel. It is patriotic language used to mask service to US imperial interests. The reality is Albanese is not charting a new course. He is not bravely challenging the most powerful leaders of the world to think for himself. He is drifting. He's desperately clinging to a sinking US empire while trying to convince Australians that this represents independence and strategic thinking. He's not thinking, he's drowning. And that's the fundamental problem here at precisely the moment when Australia needs genuine multi-alignment in its policy, when it needs to think seriously for itself about its place in a multipolar world, who its friends and interests and affinities are really with. This incredible multicultural dynamic society that we have, when Australia could follow the course, the great model provided by India of multi-alignment. Its leaders are doubling down on dumb dependence while dressing it up in the language of sovereignty. I'll be doing another video soon on the history of this John Curtin and this famous moment in history, and John Curtin's concept of the Fourth British Empire. It is an instructive story because Australia's role has so often been to be the sub-imperial power. It has so often been something partly drawn from Australian culture and society, but primarily driven by the elites who get to have the status and the power and the influence to feel that they are not merely national leaders, that they are people who play an outsized role, who punch above their weight as a middle power on the international stage by controlling part of a greater empire. It once was Britain, today it's the USA, but those days are dying. Australia should really wake up to itself and develop a different approach to its foreign policy. Thanks for watching. If anything in this video resonated with you, do go over to jeffrich.substack.com. You can join up there to my weekly writing on world affairs and world history, where I help you adapt to live in tune with these changing trends in the world. And you can become a paid subscriber there for just $5 US a month or $50 US a year. One cup of coffee, one trashy newspaper, daily newspaper a month. And I tell you what, there is a lot more insight in my writings and videos than you'll get from one trashy newspaper. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again soon.